nice twist to have somebody play while we're getting set up instead of me talking. I always notice folks would rather hear musicianers than me talking. But I'll be doing some talking this morning, mostly asking questions, as we have our annual tradition started by Sonny Oaks of bringing folks together with a lot of experience and sort of doing an oral history on stage. The easiest time I ever had was Ramblin' Jack Elliott, because I only had to ask one question and we were done.
Did he phone it in from a telephone booth, the answer to it?
I just said, tell me about that trip you made with Frank Hamilton and Guy Carawan down south.
All right.
An hour later, I said, everybody thanks Ramblin' Jack Elliott.
That's it, yeah. That's it.
So we'll get started here. I'll throw, we got Norman, Nancy, and David Wilkes. And I'm going to start with David here, and it's a question I'd get asked almost every day when I was in southeast Kentucky. How did you end up here?
Here in the business or here in Florida?
Here in the business.
Yeah, right. Well, I was just a big fan of folk music and the civil rights organization and, you know, the whole thing about singer-songwriters. But actually, I think when I was 8 years old, I went to a camp in Phoenicia, New York, called Camp Woodland. And one evening, this guy was playing banjo around a fire, and it ended up being Pete Seeger. And I think that was like a salmon finding its roots or whatever, the stream. That was it for me. And then hung around Greenwich Village, hung around the bitter end, made friends with a bunch of artists, helped them in their careers, and became a manager. I discovered, you want me to go into that? Or just,
Yeah, go on.
All right. I discovered, I met Jerry Jeff Walker, and he had a song called Mr. Bojangles on WBAI radio. Nowhere else, you know, this little public station. And I thought that should be a hit, and so I shouldn't say offered my services, because it was just me. And I helped him make a deal with Atco Records, and we had a big hit with that record, recorded in Memphis. Then I met Emmylou Harris, and Dave Bromberg was the one who introduced me to both Jerry Jeff Walker and Emmylou. And all of a sudden, I was in the business, you know. But it was a unique time. Greenwich Village was a special time in those days. All the things to have a career were in place. All you had to do is have good taste and be lucky, you know.
Yeah. Well, Nancy, you play the old-fashioned traditional cello.
Yes, I did.
How did a cellist end up in the world of traditional music?
Well, okay. Well, as you heard yesterday, being a boomer and being a girl, we got a lot of lessons in a lot of things. And my training was orchestral, and I played in the junior high school. I started in a string music program in elementary school, and I played in the junior high school orchestra, and then I played in the high school orchestra. And then when I moved to Nashville my senior year, and I played in the Nashville Youth Symphony for 1 year under the direction of Dr. Thor Johnson. And then I got all teen pregnant and fell out, and then I was in baby world, and then I was living in West Nashville, and we were remembering this just the other day. That's the zone where I lost my music altogether, and my grandmother, on my mother's side, always used to ask me growing up, are you keeping up with your music? And I'd say, if I said yes, I felt good about myself, and if I said no, I felt like I'd been sluggard, you know, slacking off, and I felt bad. So, and then the other person who ever came to me with that was Bill Monroe later on, and we'd go out to his farm, and he'd say, "Did you bring your music with you?" And that's just a sidebar. Back to the story. First night out after 6 months, I walked from Illinois Avenue across Charlotte, all the way around Murphy Road, all the way up to West End, all the way down to the only coffee house in Nashville at that time, which was the Marketplace. And just like I'd been to the Vanguard in Kansas City, I remember, they've got beatnik hippie tea. They got the Liptons and and the lemonade. So I went upstairs, and Norman says it was the first playing of the Aeroplane Band. It was John Hartford, Norman, and Tut, and Vassar. And of course, they were playing string music, and I missed, being in the, but I also like what these guys had that I didn't have that I wanted really bad was the ability to play by ear. So after that night, I was like destroyed, and I realized I didn't want to be a slave to European music. I wanted to help develop American music, because the records this man helped bring out, the Vanguard Baez records you were talking about, my mother got every one of those, and we heard that over and over growing up. She used to sing along with the records, so I have a memory not only of Joan Baez, but my mother singing along with. And went to see Peter, Paul, and Mary at Kansas City when they filled an 8,000-seat hall. It was like, holy moly. I could see that it was good for the people to hear this kind of music from an early age on. And I got exposed to Leonard Bernstein and the children's program and all that really good stuff. And so I started playing with this married couple, Jack and Liz Williams, songwriters. He later, after they split up, he went to New York and did Sweeney Todd, and she went back to Texas to songwrite. So these were interesting people. And they would write me out cello lines, and I could learn them, and I could remember them behind the songs and play along, and that was a good start. And then I started playing by ear with Sam and Marcia Ruth in Nashville, another married couple that had the auto harp and the guitar and the original songs going. So that was developing. Then we opened a show for Norman at the Exit Inn, and I heard him play solo, and I just was like some kind of little puppy dog after that. I just followed him all over town. Just couldn't stop listening to him.
Yeah.
And so that's basically how I've...
46 years later.
Yeah.
46 years, yeah.
So that's the end of mine. The only thing I know about Ramblin' Jack is when we used to go up to the Ark in Ann Arbor when it was still in the big house. They put us in the same room where Jack had been, and I walked over to the corner where the little sink was. I said, God, that is the same sink that Ramblin' Jack has pissed in. I felt special. All of a sudden, I was in the circle.
Circle is right.
Well, that's the same thing she's talking about. David Siglin that ran the Ark in Ann Arbor. Jack Elliott was supposed to play there, and he was late for the gig. And he called up on the telephone, and he was trying to do the set out of the phone booth.
Phone it in. I saw Dave in Montreal back in February.
Did you? Yeah. Some of their grandchildren or something, they come by our house in Rising Pond a couple of times. He and David and Linda. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was on the Folk Alliance board with Anya for like 6 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Norman, you were born here in Chattanooga, but when
Yes,
you were
sir.
about 11 months old or so, you decided to move
My
out of
family,
town.
they got me out of town quick. Yeah.
You got a job someplace else.
That's right. His dad told him, yeah, get a job.
What was the musical environment you grew up in?
The first playing that I did, well, I was hearing stuff on the radio in those days, like there was country bands on the radio live, and old records, old phonograph records. There's people that lived on our place, that little tenant house we had, and they had a wind-up phonograph, and they had a lot of Roy Acuff records. And so that's some of the first things that I heard was Roy Acuff. And then I had a cousin, a distant cousin, lived down the railroad track about a mile and a half. There was a fiddle player, and he played guitar and old-time banjo as well. And I'd go down there when I was about 11 years old, and he would get his fiddle down and teach me how to second behind the fiddle, you know. Tell me when I wasn't changing chords in the right place and stuff like that. And just hearing local musicians, you know, that was in the country then that nobody ever heard of, you know, not professionals or anything, but just old records, radio, and just local people, mostly was what it was.
When was the first time you played out?
The first time that I actually played on stage or something like, golly. Well, we were going, when we were just kids, we were going up to Knoxville, Tennessee, to WNOX radio. I had a barn dance show up there, and the midday merry-go-round was during the week, and then they had the Tennessee barn dance on Saturday night. And Lowell Blanchard was the MC of that show for many years, and started a lot of people in country music. And he would give us a spot on that barn dance every Saturday night. So we'd go up there and do that on WNOX. Was probably some of the first actual playing like that. First time I ever played really in public was on the radio, was with a church program in Fort Payne, Alabama. WZOB radio in Fort Payne. And we go down there and play in the church service. But that was really the first time that I got on the radio, was then. Radio was kind of still, you know, there was live radio still in those days. It was kind of on the tail end of phasing out, you know, as a thing, but there was enough of it around that we got into it, you know.
Well, David,
Yeah.
why don't you tell the folks what an A&R man is, because most people nowadays don't know that term, and how you became one.
Well, do they know what a record company is? I mean, just like... So A&R is artists and repertoire, and the job of an A&R guy is to have an open door, listen to people, be accessible, which I always was, and find those unique artists that had something to say, and then talk them into signing with your label that you worked at. So at Vanguard, which is my first record label that I worked at, it was, you know, it was easy because most people came to Vanguard, knew the label, loved it as you did, and it was, you know, so it was. I had to be very tasty, and then I'd start calling up lawyers and other managers and anybody that I knew and say, hey, what's happening? You know, so I came down to Nashville in 1970 for Vanguard and signed Dave Loggins, you know. Oh. Most people wouldn't come to Vanguard first because even though it was a great artistic label, it wasn't a label that spent a lot of money on making records or marketing. So the repertoire part of an A&R was very, very important because it was the records and the artists that sold the records. It wasn't a massive marketing company. So, and I was good at that.
That's the hard work.
Yeah, well, it was fun work also.
Yeah.
How long did you
making it
do
happen,
that?
Yeah.
Well, at Vanguard, I was there 4 years. Then I started my own business in management, and I ended up also working at MCA Music. Actually, I worked at MCA Music before I went to Vanguard. And I actually had a record called Long, Long Time with Linda Ronstadt that Gary White wrote. And this is really interesting because I was managing Paul Siebel, and, you know, and we wanted to do a showcase at the Cafe A Go-Go, which was right across the street from the Bitter End. So Gary White, Dave Bromberg, Paul, and I think it was the four of them. And I heard this song Long, Long Time. I think I heard it there, right at the stage. I said, wow, that's an amazing, amazing song. And then Bromberg said, you know, Linda Ronstadt is actually walking down the street. So I said, get her, bring her here. I want her to hear this song. And she came and she loved it and she asked me to send her a lead sheet because I had signed that to MCA Music while I was working there. And so I sent a lead sheet and a copy of the record over to her. And the next thing I knew, she did it. There was a guy who was a producer named Elliot. I can't think of his last name, but When the album came out, I think it was Stone Ponies was the album. That was, what, Pearls Before Swine. I don't know. That's something else. I did a kind of research on all the FM stations that we knew, right? And not every station, but almost every station was picking Long, Long Time as the song they were playing. So I called Capitol Records up and I told them, hey, this is the song that should be the single. It's a hit. And they did some research and agreed. And then when they told the producer that this is going to be the single, he said, why is Dave Wilkes fooling with my arts, my repertoire? Well, I published a song through MCA, and I signed it, so I was involved. So he called up my boss, and my boss, which was probably the #1 guy in the publishing world, in the international, a guy named Sal Chianti, but it was always Mr. Chianti, of course, yeah. And he called me in. He was a great guy, and a great leader. And he said, Dave, what's the story? You got a producer pissed off at you. And I said, well, here's the results on Long, Long Time. Here's all the airplay, not all of it, but, this is going to be a hit for us. I said, okay, great. And instead of getting fired, I got a $75 a week raise. Yeah, so.
Well, Nancy, and Norman can jump in on this too, has being a couple, being life mates, and being together so much allowed you to go a lot deeper into the music than if you were just two people who met when you're going out to rehearse or tour?
Yes and no. Yes, in the aspect that if you're really hanging out on the road like you do, then you can think and talk and bounce ideas, and then when you get back to the instruments, you can try it out and see if it's worth what you thought it was. A lot of ideas, not all of them good. That's my job. But you help me, Norman.
Okay. You was just talking about getting the music together or getting into it by being together. Yeah, that's a thing because you don't leave, you take it home with you.
Yeah,
and that could be good or bad, in either direction.
Yeah, and to flesh out my no answer, the answer is no, because individual practice, familiarity with your own instrument and what you're trying to say and what you're trying to add to the material. One part of my orchestral training that bled over into my music with Norman was whatever you play, here's Vivaldi, here's Beethoven, here's Copland, and I'm going naga naga naga, because because I bring a historical reference to my work, and so to change gears that fast, but I like acting like whatever music, and Jerry Douglas like this too. Somebody was talking about him earlier. He has the same feeling about it. You just treat every piece of music that you're playing right then as the only music in the world. And that's what orchestral training gives you, that bleeds over well into folk music, because if you're singing a ballad about somebody's life and time and you don't put 100% into it, it's going to sound inauthentic and you're going to be sorry you recorded it.
By the way, I want to make a correction. Linda's album was called Silk Purse. And
That's it.
yeah, and that record the album went to #1. Long, Long Time went top 10 probably. Then later on in that decade, she signed to Geffen, and they put that album out, or they put that song out again, which went to #1. And I think from the decade of 1970 to 1980, in the MCA Universal Music Catalog, which was a gigantic company, right? That was a #1 earner that whole decade. So I think I should have asked for $80.
Well, Norman, what took you to Nashville?
Oh boy. Excuse me. We had a little group back there years ago, and we were trying to get on record back in the 50s. And we had 2 guitars, and I was playing dobro, and we had an upright bass player. And we wanted to get on record. It was kind of, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the old act of Johnny and Jack that used to be on the Grand Ole Opry. And we sounded somewhat like them, I suppose, in those days. And we went to Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, to the old Union Avenue studio there where all the historic things happened. And Jack Clement, better known in later years as Cowboy Clement in Nashville, was in charge of the studio there. And Jack recorded us over there in Memphis for about 3 days, trying to fuse us into something. That was the deal in those days, was to make something out of you that you weren't, to make it commercially palatable. And so he did that for about 3 days with us, and Sun never released any of that stuff at that point. Some of it did get released later on Bear Family Records, just in a historic fashion. A group called the Dixieland Drifters was the name of that group. But then after that, when we didn't have any real success with Sun, we went to Nashville. And there was a gentleman over there that had a studio. Murray Nash was his name, and he had been the A&R man for Mercury Records and was responsible for getting the Tennessee Waltz recorded by the first time out. Pee Wee King, who Red Stewart, Pee Wee's fiddle player, wrote it, and the record company didn't want to put it out, and they were doing 4 sides in New York or somewhere, and so Murray told him, says, well, you just save that one for last and tell them that you're not going to do any more, do the 3, and if they don't let you do that one, you're not going to do any more. And so they did, and put the Tennessee Waltz out, and everybody knows what a historic hit that was. But anyway, we got involved with Murray Nash over there and put out some records on a label called BB, which was for Blake and Blake. My father was involved in it, and we did several records for Murray Nash, and that got us kind of into the Nashville scene a little bit. We would go down and do the Friday Night Grand Ole Opry. We did that, and we did the Ernest Tubb Record Shop, Midnight Jamboree. We appeared on that, and had a little minor success with those recordings,
Minor success. You said, but your dad told me that there was all kind of letters coming in with the women's wanting to marry you.
Well, you know how it is with us rockabillys. So that was our Nashville foray, you might say, I guess. And I'd like to backtrack on something else that a while ago, if I might, while I'm editorializing here. I haven't been in front of one of these in about 3 years yet, forgive me. We're talking about the cello and the traditional deal with that. It seemed like, when we started doing that, a lot of people thought that was really revolutionary or new. It was to them, but it was a very old thing, because the old string band tradition, both black and white string bands had cellos in them as a bass instrument in the 1920s and before. In a lot of the old records, it was very common to have a cello in a string group like that. So,
and that's a throwback thing. The reason was because you could fit a cello in a wagon easier than a bass.
But we were doing it. We had, and I'd like to say right off the top of my head that I meant to yesterday, but I'll take this opportunity to say that when we had a trio, Nancy played cello and I played guitar, and we had James Bryan on the fiddle. And for that period of time and that string band trio thing that we were doing, James Bryan was a very vital part of that. And,
yes, absolutely.
So I certainly give credit to him being part of that sound of what we did,
And I don't know what, we had a jazz headspace on about playing with each other, even though it came out sounding like what it sounded like. The string, the fiddle tunes, the original tunes, and whatever. But we never told each other what to play.
We operated more like a jazz trio as far as our headspace was concerned.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
what I'm trying to
on
say.
our approach to the actual playing.
And that was a lot of fun.
We were playing traditional music, but we approached it in a sense from the headspace of a jazz group, more or less in that sense of the word, I think. But I give James a lot of credit. He's a very well kept secret. He doesn't push himself out very far, and
Yeah,
been in ill health for a number of years, have problems, but he's a wonderful fiddle player, has a repertoire. I have played with many fiddle players in my time, playing guitar with them. I've never played with one that knew more music than he does. His repertoire is amazing. It's vast.
Which I can only underscore by saying that when we had a little short group with Courtney and Hazel Johnson, the Planet Riders, I played fiddle of tunes that learned from James. I didn't play the same tune for 3 days. And that's just what I soaked up being around him.
Yeah.
That's what James Bryan knows.
We used to call him the human cassette.
Yeah, I haven't seen James Bryan in a long time, but back in the day, I definitely spent more time with James than y'all.
Yeah.
He played with us off and on over a 40-year period. So,
I remember when you did our Fire on the Mountain TV show, I had the room next to y'all, and Carl was with you then. The
Carl
four of you
Jones,
would
yeah.
play. I'd hear you, I'd go to sleep with y'all playing
Yeah.
and wake up with y'all playing.
we played a lot. Yeah, we played a lot.
Well, David, what was it like in the club world in Greenwich Village in the early 60s when so much was happening at both the basket house level and at the major label level?
It made the folk explosion. You had the Bitter End on Bleecker Street. Across the street, you had the Cafe Wah, Cafe A-Go-Go. Down the block and around the corner, you had the Gaslight Cafe. You had Gertie's Folk City a block above, And you can go from one to another, and you can hear Richie Havens in one. You can hear Carolyn Hester in one, in another. You can hear Kenny Rogers and Mike Settle and the First Edition in the Bitter End. Before, I don't know what happened to Mike Settle. He was such an amazing musician. Peter, Paul, and Mary would play in the Bitter End. It's pretty cool to be able to see them in a room of maybe 190 people. Woody Allen would do a show there. So the Bitter End had a format: a folk singer, a comedian, and a featured act. And the featured act was always a national touring act. And the comedian was probably a New York comedian, like Woody Allen, a starter type of a comedian. And then a folk singer from many places. Gamble Rogers, by the way, was one.
Oh, I miss him terribly.
I got to tell you the story
I
about
love
Gamble.
Gamble. Oh.
He was in the Serendipity Singers, which is managed by Fred Weintraub, who owned the Bitter End. And then when he left, I became his manager. And I took him and Emmylou Harris. RCA wanted to give Gamble a demo session. So I took him in to do a session, and then I snuck Emmylou Harris in when the tapes were over, and she did like 3 songs. So, of course, RCA passed on both of them. I mean, talking about an A&R, right? Yeah. But then, I could go on forever with these kind of stories, but that was all Greenwich Village, One real big surprise for me was when I moved to Florida in maybe I started to come down to Florida maybe 2009, 10, and I'm driving down Route 95. And all of a sudden, I go by Census, Gamble Rogers State Park, and I was thrilled and shocked. I had no idea, And then of course I started to ask questions. I had known he drowned.
Yeah.
And he was a hero,
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I have to attend that. I hope because.
Yeah, he drowned. He was saving.
Yes.
He was attempting to save another drowning
Right.
person and was dragged under, and that is a lesson in itself.
He was an elegant guy, a true gentleman, and
He's the first man I ever heard say scattergun input. And I said, oh, that's what you're, oh, I ever have memories of the Winnipeg Folk Festival of Norman and Gamble meeting up in the room. That was the same year we met Boys of the Lock, and it was already after you'd caused the rocket launch, you know, because we just hadn't found each other yet. But what you started there, like Mayor McDougal Street style, man, you had it going on. What I'm talking about is, did you get to see the Llewyn Davis movie, Inside Llewyn Davis?
Hated it.
You hated it. I wanted to ask you what you thought,
I was
because
pissed off.
you were there,
yeah.
and I have memories, and
They made Gene look like a slut. You know, they made Tom Paxton look like a goofball. Why those producers who are big name producers, why would they even do this subject? They didn't have anything to do with it. They didn't know about it. That was so disappointing.
I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, Gamble was my buddy back in the day. I remember sitting in a hotel room watching a football game with him, and his beloved Miami Hurricanes blew a 31-point lead against Maryland, and that was a mighty sad man.
But he probably didn't say a mean or a curse word about it because he was such an elegant gentleman. Right? Jeez.
Yes, that's the absolute truth. Yeah.
Well, Norman, how did you work into the session scene and the road musician scene?
When I got over there later on, like I said, we'd gone there and played with a little band that we had. I was working around Chattanooga here some. We'd play Lake Winnipesaukee out here. People from Nashville would come down and they'd need backup musicians, and we got tapped for some things like that. I did, and June Carter came down to do some shows for the TVA, and she needed musicians. So Gene Goforth, who was an agent here in Chattanooga, worked out of the Dome building up here, was booking those things, and so he picked me and another guitar player that I'd worked with, an electric guitar player named LeBron Winton, and then Bob Johnson, who was a banjo player down at Wallaceville, Georgia, here around Chickamauga, that I had worked with for off and on, you know, early on, as a kind of a folk type duo thing. And then we had a group called the Lonesome Travelers with Walter Forbes. But anyway, I'm digressing there. But June, and it went back to Nashville after we'd worked these dates. And in the meantime, I had gotten drafted into the Army and was serving 2 years in the Caribbean in the Panama Canal Zone. And Bob Johnson, the banjo player, had gotten through her to play on some sessions with Johnny Cash. She had gotten hooked up with Johnny Cash at that point, before they married or anything, this was. And I got out of the Army in September of 1963 and came back here, and Bob Johnson said to me, he says, I'm going over to do a Johnny Cash recording session. Would you like to go with me? Ride over. And I thought, well, yeah, I ain't got anything else to do. So I went over with Bob, and we walked into the Columbia studio in Nashville, and June immediately saw me, and she said to John, she said, John says, this is Norman Blake, says, the fellow I've told you about, says he plays the dobro and the guitar. And John turned right around. He'd never heard me play a note, you know, only her word, what she said there. And he said, well, he says, if you can get a dobro, he said, I'll use you tomorrow. He said, I've been wanting to do a record with the mariachi trumpets and a dobro. So I borrowed a dobro, I believe from Buck Graves, Uncle Josh, that played with Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. And we recorded, the next day, recorded a tune called Bad News Travels Like Wildfire. Was the first one, I believe, that I cut with him. And I started playing, And he came over and he said, Johnny, and he said to me, he said, well, that's real good. He says, but he says, that's too good for one of my records. he says, can you play about half as much and play it on single strings? And I said, sure. So that kind of got me into playing. Then of course, then the Bob Johnson, not the same Bob Johnson. Bob Johnson, the banjo player, but Bob Johnston, the A&R man there in Nashville for Columbia at the time, that was recording Johnny Cash. This was after the English gentleman, I forget, that was A&R man. I can't remember his name.
Art Satherley?
No, it's not Art Satherley. Uncle Art. It was between Uncle Art. There was another, Don Law. Don Law was the A&R man. So Bob Johnston followed Don Law as A&R man, and so then he was responsible for getting the musicians for the Bob Dylan session, and I got included in that clique of musicians through the producer Bob Johnston, and then working with Johnny Cash and just working various things around. Got into some sessions that I was playing there, as part of making a living at that time. And I had moved to Nashville in 1969, summer of '69, to play with Johnny Cash on that television show that he did.
That you tuned all the instruments
Yeah.
for.
Yeah, that was before they had all the tuners going like they do now so much. And I was kind of a go-between
Golden ear.
on that show, like Johnny's group, the Tennessee Three, and then you had an orchestra. Bill, I've lost his name, that was the head of the orchestra, the leader. And I was a go-between, sort of between the orchestra and Johnny's group, because Johnny's group didn't savvy much anything about music very much formally, and I had enough knowledge at least to be able to communicate between the old ear side and the orchestra side a little bit. So, and then I would I've tuned Johnny's guitar and stuff like that, because he liked to tune a half tone off. He would tune the cape we put the capo on the first fret and tune it. So I was a guitar tuner. As you say, I was the highest paid guitar tuner. Anyway. So,
They gave you your peers
Yeah.
gave you a golden ear.
yeah, they gave me a little golden ear, called it the Nashville ear.
The Nashville. That's right. I didn't want you to forget that part. It goes with that story.
So that's kind of how I got into that, I guess.
Well, Nancy told us a while ago how y'all got together, but between the session work and y'all getting together, you did a solo album, started doing that, you started doing your own music, and
Right.
you started writing. And with Ginseng Sullivan, I always have incredible admiration for somebody that can write an old folk song and it be their new composition. I mean, Merle Travis did a whole album of them, and Robert Hunter can do that, but it's a rare skill.
Ginseng Sullivan was a true song. Yeah, there was an individual, he was real. He was a real herb digger that came walking down the railroad track in Sulphur Springs, Georgia when I was a boy growing up. So that song's about him, yeah.
Didn't you say he said everything twice?
Yeah, well, I kind of do that too. But yeah, he said everything. Like he'd talk about his dogs. He lived up in a shack.
Other people were starting to make solo albums. The Newgrass Revival, there was some solo work coming out of there. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to keep up, and back then I held illusions that I could, I need to make an album of all original tunes, which maybe someday in digital heaven they'll put all back together. I had it in my mind, the reason we made so many albums is one year at the foot of the mountain when we had no TV, I read Great Expectations aloud to Norman and my daughter Joy. And I saw the beauty of each chapter being complete unto itself, leading to the other. And so my plan as an oldster was to sit down and listen to all the albums in sequence, in totality, because for each one we had a chapter concept. Now everybody scrambles stuff, but we had to let's put this song first. These belong in the middle, and we want to end with this one, and it was the whole album process, as you know. So I was gonna, but now it's so scrambled up. And they cut some of my tunes out of that album. So I have one good copy left that Bill Monroe signed. He didn't say, he just like about, do you bring your music with you? Your music, your music. He didn't say bluegrass music. It didn't have to be bluegrass. He just wanted you to grow as a musician enough that you could show the fruit of your own labor, of your own thoughts, your own heart, your own joy, your own anguish, your own agony. Everything that you got, you put in your music, because that's what we were doing back then. We were like the first, I want to remind people of something. The first people in history, and the French give us credit for this, was back in the late 60s, early 70s, the first people on earth to rise up from the inside and stop a war from the inside. And that is getting lost in the downstream push. And so anybody who thinks that they're not, you know, that like a pissant running up the elephant's leg with rape on its mind, you know, if that's what it feels like to be a folkie in 2019, you know, then I'm just saying. It do make a difference what you do.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You concur with that assessment of history?
100%.
I mean, who doesn't, a peer group, who doesn't remember Chicago and the Democratic Convention and culminating in the, you know, the reason we found each other was because we were, what I thought, we were like what they fought for. My dad was a war hero. He was in Iwo Jima before the Marines landed. He was a radio man, and he was reconnoitering with the Army before they set up. Anyway, that's that, and I was raised boot camp style, which probably suited me for the road extraordinarily well. What am I trying to say here, Norman?
I'm not sure.
That it takes several generations for a flowering. And we were a flowering because we were the first generation who could see our way clear to not base an economy on war and to reclaim our food and our air. When I was a kid growing up, the Ohio River was on fire. The Rachel Carson book had come out. I mean, people who say, that's what they do. They juggle tenses, past, present, future. People say we're just starting. We've only got 12 years left. Well, that's true. We only have 12 years left to make the mark. But just the same, this has been going on a long time. And I just want the people, and I see it, and I'm encouraged because there's more now than ever. But, man, it matters so much, everything you do to clean up the planet. It's like one time this bishop from Bermuda, I heard him say, you children want everything God has to give, the very best that God has to give, and you can't even go clean your room. Go home and clean up your room.
There's certainly time right now for this sort of thing to happen all over again, because the world is so screwed up, and we're on the verge of maybe a war with 3 different nations, and the environment.
That's all to distract from the investigation, and you know it.
You're probably right.
But I still don't want my people dying for it. I mean, anybody who's in, my dad was in the Army, and now we've got like 4, including him, 4 generations, and it's like we've all been in the Army. And the men have all gone crazy because there's this guy yelling at them like a bad uncle every day on the TV, and he says, shut up. But anyway, he won't. And sometimes I really and honestly and truly think the men have all lost their minds. The women are going to have to save this country.
Right. This is right.
We'll give it back when we get the house in order.
The women's empowerment sessions at 2 o'clock this afternoon.
That's all I got to
There's a
say
panel
about
on
it.
women's empowerment and folk music.
Okay.
Sorry. You
Ladies unite.
Well, David, how did the Coffee House Circuit Agency come to be?
Okay. So when I was at the bitter end, Fred Weintraub, the owner, and a gentleman from a university in North Carolina, Davidson University, decided that they wanted to set up a circuit of colleges, and they would coordinate it with various regions. And they wanted the bitter end to supply the artists. And so Fred and I and a few other people at the bitter end arranged for a showcase, and we would call C. Shaw Smith was the administrator, great guy. So he got like 8 or 9 regional student directors at the universities. They came into New York. We did a showcase for them. We had people like Jerry Jeff and Emmylou Harris and Jim Croce and Harry Chapin. I mean, amazing people in early stages, right? So they did the showcase, and all these people at the various schools, flipped out. The way they would do it is they would all agree on a couple of acts. They would take one act to their university and perform at a coffee shop, a coffee house, or on the campus. And they would work for 3 days. And if you had one person in the group, you got $75. No, the first person got 100, and every additional person in the group got an additional $75. You worked 3 days, you got a gas allotment depending on where your next gig was, and you got room and board. So, $75 or $100 in 1967 was not a bad...
That buys a lot of gas and
Yeah.
eats.
And they threw in the gas on top of it also.
Oh my God, you
So,
can get miles.
So eventually, I think we had like 100 universities, all throughout the United States. We had the Air Force jumped on. I don't know how they got in on that, but we booked Thule Air Force Base. We did Diego Garcia in the Pacific, and Nome, Alaska. That was a tour for somebody. That was a rough one, and they flew in cargo, Air Force cargo planes, And I managed one of the acts that went on that, so I don't know if she ever forgave me. So, 3 days at one school, 1 day travel, and 3 days at the next. So let's say you could do RPI in upstate New York, 3 days. Then 3 days later you would do SUNY New Paltz. 3 days later you would do Albany State. It was amazing. And the people that came off of that and had careers and eventually became big stars were, it must be 20 or 30 of them, It's an extraordinary time.
And was this before NACA? I think I have the acronym right.
No, NACA this was before. I think it was NEC. Yeah. And then we did a big showcase in Washington, D.C., and we finally said to the people there, we're not making any money on this. We're hiring staff. We're making phone calls. In those days, a phone call was not cheap, right? It was crazy. So we wanted to charge 10% for every act that was on it, which they wouldn't have minded. We could even have raised their fee just to cover our expenses. And NEC said, oh, this is an educational thing. You can't do that. Boom, boom, boom. We had a lot of supporters with the NEC, but there was a bunch of people in the schools that we didn't really know that well personally. So they decided they could do it, take it over and do it themselves. They took it over, it lasted for a year and failed. I bought the company maybe 15 or 20 years after that, 1980, or it was 1978, 80. We ran it again, and it was great, but the whole thing about the folk touring at that moment was kind of a little passé. That was it.
Yeah, speaking of touring, I get tired of seeing one Prevost bus after another outside Cat's Cradle every day. And I remember Norman and Nancy in that old school bus. What's the best thing about not being on the road anymore, and is there anything at all you miss?
I genuinely miss the rapport between a well-played concert and an attentive audience. And I've lost strength in my hands, and my voice isn't what it was, and I kind of miss being at the peak of my powers, but that was then and this is now, and it feels like a good start for the rest of my life. I feel like the work is done for us, and ongoing. And now it is time to turn our attention to helping society in other ways, because the music is there and will always be there. And the strong peak people now and the young ones coming up, they have more than got it covered. I mean, they have so much to learn from. I don't hear anybody playing now who's actually not better than I ever was. So, you know, I kind of miss that, but I like the feeling of playing with other musicians and that. But we get to play around the house when we feel like it, and our backs, we got truck driver complaints. And you know, I like it that the house doesn't move. You say, Norm.
What was the question?
What's the best about being off the road, and is there anything you miss?
Just being able to stay in one place. Yeah. We traveled so long, you know, for so many years, and we didn't fly. We did it all on the ground. And
Carried all our own instruments, loaded and unloaded, did all of that.
We did more driving than we did playing, you know, in a way.
And I don't know what to tell anybody doing it now, because for every one person out there then, there's like 7 more now. And so I don't know what to tell people, except maybe Skype each other. That's not as good as. I'm sorry, it's just not as good as. It's a room full of people. And you're talking about the college circuit, we really got a good start there. And that had such a good effect on us as musicians, playing all those different colleges, because you heard a lot of interesting, well thought through feedback that made you, on your miles to the next place, really full of ideas.
Yeah, and you developed an audience of appreciation for, you know, bright young people who supposedly are going to change the world.
Yeah, and sometimes when Norman sits around in his old age and says, I don't know if I did anything or not, I says, well, you know, changing how everybody in America plays the guitar is kind of a heavy lift.
Oh, Lord. Well, you know, going back and talking about just a perspective that would give you a reason to know why that you want to stay in one place. I see places on television these days. Sometimes you'll see a picture out west or something, you know, and we say, oh, I've been there, you know, that was great. I enjoyed being there, being out there, and look at it and say, well, I get kind of nostalgic for that. I wouldn't even mind seeing that again. But looking at the picture of it, even on television, to me, speaking personally, it sometimes just looking at a picture of a far-off place that I've been makes me homesick to want to be home. Just looking at a picture, because I know how it would feel if I was there that far. I'd want to be that far from home ever again. That's it. And I can't even explain that, but that's the way it feels to me, is I just don't want to be that far away, you know.
And you can form an idea about a place, and then you get there and the air and the light is entirely different than what you imagined, you know, and it gives you an entirely different feeling than you thought you would have. But I'm grateful for all the places we've been, all the lower 48, and I've been to Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico's the only ones left out right now, and I'm getting there. But when I see those pictures, I go into memory zone, and I have a lot of good memories of a lot of great people, and I can feel the sunlight in that zone on my skin. I can smell the air. Right. And I wish, that's what I don't know if the kids know, or, well, they globetrot more than we ever did anyway. They know. But, just to know what the dirt feels like there, and to smell the sage fields in the out west, and the deserts and the mountains. Big joke on us in Denver shows when you get road burnt how stupid you can turn out. They booked us in Leadville out of Denver, and we were looking at the Rand McNally, and he said, oh, look, that's not very far.
You lose the rambling urge, you know, when you're young and you got an adventure in front of you, and got your music and you're learning it and everything, and it's all happening, you know, you got an urge to be out there, and you're at home wherever you are. But as you grow older, in my case, that's the way I put it, I've lost the rambling urge. I don't have that anymore.
And it will
I've
cost
seen
you.
enough of the world, you know. It's out there, I know it, you know. And the old saying that it's the best place sometimes is right in your own backyard, you know, and that's no true thing, really.
Tend the garden, keep it nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I just go to town one day a week. Anyway, I've been asking a whole lot of questions. Anybody out there have a question?
No, no.
It's not something that I prepared to scare you. You just piqued my interest, David. You said you were managing Paul Sebo,
Yeah,
and when an album came out, Woodstock and Orange, did you sign it to Jeff
Yes.
Walker? That album, to my opinion, was an incredible album. We released it in Europe. I probably sold 12 copies. Totally
right.
fantastic. And then I forgot about it. So for the last couple of years, I thought I wanted the CD of that album. And it's probably the only album that Electra Records did never release on CD. What happened to Paul Sebo?
By the way, Rounder got the rights to Paul's albums, I think, and somehow reissued that Wood Smoke and Oranges and the other one that Electra did. Paul is living somewhere in Delaware, and I think he's just driving a truck. He says he's not writing anymore.
Did he have the wrong manager at the time?
Maybe. But he did pretty well during those days, and he was so influential in introducing me to so many people. That Linda Ronstadt album that I talked about, the Big Earner, there's a Paul Siebel song on it. There was 2 Gary White songs, Nobody's, which was the name of the restaurant above the Bitter End that we ran, and of course, Long Time. And Paul's song, I think, was Nashville Again or Tomorrow. I don't. No. Louise. That. Yeah, and Bonnie Raitt also did that song, and yeah, so he's basically living on his publishing royalties. MCA Music is still a good company and pays their royalties fairly and properly.
Yeah, Jeff? Yes.
Nancy and Norman, I've admired your work, your music, and your songs for years. Last Train, Poor Valley, one of my favorites. Do you have any, Norman, I guess particularly, do you have any memorable, any good memories, memorable stories from the sessions on the Circle album?
Memorable stories from the Circle album? You talking about that first Nitty Gritty Dirt Band record? Yeah, I got one that I probably shouldn't tell, but
Go ahead.
you want the inside expose type?
We're both friends.
Okay.
Go for it, right?
Well, it involves how I came to play on that record. I played with Earl Scruggs on there, and played the dobro with Earl, and I played some, I guess, with the Dirt Band. I've forgotten. I never have heard that whole record all the way through. I have it, but I've never listened to it all the way through. But anyway, I was working with John Hartford at the time, playing an aerial plane band. We had been off somewhere, God knows where, and flown into Nashville on an airplane on an early morning flight, about daylight maybe or something like that. We got back into Nashville. And I didn't feel well. I had kind of caught cold out on the road. And so I went home, went to bed. And they called over at the house, said, would I come over to the studio and play dobro? And I said, no, we just got off the road and I don't feel very good. You know, I'm sick. And so I said, why don't you get Tut Taylor, who plays in the band also, you know, in the airplane band, plays the dobro. I said, Tut could probably do the dobro for you, and he'd be glad to. And so they called Tut. Tut went over to the studio, and they weren't getting what they wanted out of Tut. So they called me back a couple of times, And by that time, I was awake, and, you know, they had kept me up a little bit. So I said, okay, I'll come over. So I go over there to Woodland Sound Studios in Nashville where they were recording. And Woodland was a big studio. They were in the big room there. And studio and a glass control room down one end. And so I started playing dobro with Earl Scruggs, and we were recording the old Carter family song, You Are My Flower. And Bill McEwen, John McEwen, of course, played the banjo in the Dirt Band, but Bill McEwen, his brother, was producing that album. And he was in the control room. So he didn't like what I was doing either. So he kept on, do you do this or do that, and so forth and so on. And I tried, you know, this and that, but nothing seemed to please him about it. And so I was not feeling good anyway. So he kept on and kind of riding me a little bit about it. And so I had on earphones and sitting there, and he kept on, and I took the earphones off and threw them and hit the glass of the control room and told him to go to hell. So anyway, then about that time, Earl Scruggs stepped in, and Earl always spoke in doing my Scruggs imitation, always spoke in a real quavery voice himself, and he says to Bill, he says, well, if you leave him alone, he'll play something good. So that's the story I can tell that was memorable about it. So.
Yeah, Mitch?
You may have, I was a couple minutes late getting in here, and you may have already addressed this question. If you have, that's fine. Norman, you have impacted, both of you have impacted us in so many ways in our lives, and what we do as artists and how we want to look at something and approach it. Can you name one artist that has impacted, you feel impacted you personally, professionally, whatever, that just stands out among all the people you work with?
What one artist impacted you the most?
What's what?
What one artist impacted you the most without you?
You mean in what way? I mean, in my...
Professionally, personally, whatever, however you want to phrase it.
You didn't necessarily mean towards my music, but just in every way.
general.
What artist has had the most influence?
Yeah, first pop.
Well, I guess some of the ones that were the most influential on me were not alive at the time. I was always really a big fan of the original Carter family. The Carter family, I would have to say, would be probably the first thing. Roy Acuff was a big influence on the music.
Knee-jerk reaction, first name popped up in my head when you asked that, Mike Seeger.
Yeah, Mike,
The
I
New
had a
Lost
great
City
deal of respect.
Rambler Boys, I got to know over time, individually and briefly together, Mike, John, and Tracy. And we went to Tracy's farm one time, but Mike Seeger came to the house and we made some recordings, and just his personage and demeanor, everything about him. And then the last time I saw him was out in Colorado up at a High Plains festival, and he mastered everything he touched or thought about. He was playing an ocarina, and he did a 20-minute Garcia-like solo on this ocarina. Never missed a beat, never missed a note. The music just flowed out of him. And, you know, he couldn't figure out, we recorded the Tennessee Mountain Fox Chase at the house, and we were playing a couple of fiddles, and I was doing the harmony part and everything, and afterwards he was like, how'd you do that? Her, you know, the foxes and all that jazz. Well, how'd you get that? I said, man, that's an old orchestra. I just hung over the bar line. That was what I was going to call my bar, but then I decided I'd never make any money there. I'd just drink all the profits. So,
Yeah, I think we owe quite a debt, all of us do, to Mike Seeger. His work
Their archival
yeah,
work. John came back from South America and told me all about his trip to Machu Picchu and the way they always went around and collected Bascom Lamar Lunsford style, just songs from everybody in every place. All music has value. All people have value. I think we're all supposed to be here. I think that we're all supposed to have music in our lives, and I think that everything's just fine if we'll let it be.
Yeah, Mike came to visit me the week before he got his diagnosis. That'll always mean a lot to me. And Norman early on was talking about seconding behind the fiddle. And when Mike was trying to find the great 1920s recording artist Doc Boggs, he was asking all over Letcher County, Kentucky, and Wise County, Virginia, for Doc Boggs. And up at Neon, Kentucky, a fella said, I don't know where to find him, but I sure liked how he seconded on that banjo.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike, one record, there's a CD I have at home that I think one of my favorite ones that Mike did in the 60s. He went around just getting music, most of it from people that were just basically unknown, and it's called Close to Home is the name of the CD. It does have a cut on there by Sarah and Maybelle Carter, who hadn't played together in years. That's quite good, and but there's some people on there, some really good stuff on that record, and Mike was really into getting people that were not really professional, you know, that just made music for the sake of making music, for the joy of it.
Tell that Elizabeth Cotton story.
Yeah, well, and of course, everybody knows probably the Elizabeth Cotton story, you know, that she was working for the Seegers, and they didn't know she played the guitar even, and found she was playing in the kitchen or something, and that started off a lot there. But yeah, Mike was, I think, everybody kind of knows the Seegers as the collectors or the musicologists and that sort of thing, but a lot of people don't realize what a great musician that Mike was on many instruments. And one being the 5-string banjo, he was really a fine banjo player.
But Elizabeth got on his case.
Yeah, among other things.
She said, Mike, she was like ancient, and he was driving her around. He said, Mike, who's going to carry me around when you're dead?
When you die, who's going to carry me around?
Yeah, I worked 3.5 years across the street from where she was born.
Yeah.
But one more question before we go eat lunch. Who wants to ask it?
I want to say, do you have any good Richie Havens stories?
Yeah.
I love Richie so much.
Yeah, Richie was a great character and a warm human being. If you had an appointment with Richie, you would take him, he'd be an hour and a half late, because every time he walked down the street, somebody else would interest him. Something, you know, and everybody would talk to him and he would talk back. So, yeah, Richie is great. I do have a good story. We got a call from, I'm trying to think of what TV show, in England. It was like a gigantic TV host in England. He had his TV show, and he was doing a 10-year show on the Beatles, and they wanted Richie to come there. So they flew us to Paris, and I went with my associate Doug Yeager, whom a lot of guys might know here, myself, and Richie. Richie cashed in his first-class tickets so that both of us could go, all of us could go coach. That's the kind of guy that he was, you know, just...
Great heart.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thanks to Alan Watts, as always, for doing our sound. And big thanks to David Wilkes, Nancy Blake, and Norman Blake.